Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, so we're reacting to this Mark Felton Productions video, but I just want to. The first comment made me laugh, and it's about Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin taking a coffee break at the Yalta conference, and Churchill starts writing something down. Roosevelt asks what it is, and Churchill says he's collecting all jokes about himself. He has over 100 so far. And Stalin says, "How funny, I collect jokes about me too." "Oh, really?" Churchill says. "How many have you got?" 3 prison camps so far. Oh, people are funny. Let's go. My name's Connor if you're new. Original link to the video, top of the description. Preemptive like. Churchill visits Hitler's bunker. Let's go. Let's learn. Hi guys. Hope everyone's doing well.
With the surrender of Nazi Germany in early May 1945, Berlin found itself completely occupied by the Red Army, which had captured it following a very difficult and bloody battle. Hitler's bunker, located beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, had been captured by the Soviets on the 2nd of May 1945. And if you've seen my series about the Soviet investigation into the death of Hitler, link in the end screen, the first weeks after Berlin's capture saw frenetic Soviet efforts to investigate the alleged deaths of Hitler and his wife Eva Braun on the 30th of April 1945 and their subsequent cremation and burial outside of the bunker's emergency exit. Soviet Schmierz and NKVD intelligence officers sealed off the bunker from prying eyes, allowing few non-Soviet intelligence personnel access as they sought to find absolute proof of Hitler's death for a very skeptical Stalin in Moscow, and put to bed a rumor that Hitler had actually escaped justice. The Soviets, despite an agreement made with the Western Allied powers to divide Berlin into 4 occupation zones.
I mean, as paranoid as Stalin must have been for some stuff, I feel like that's not an unreasonable thing to kind of want to confirm. I mean, if you were to try and disguise it, saying that the bodies were burned and are now unrecognizable is exactly what you would do if you're trying to cover it up. It's also something that is likely to happen in real life, so I'm not saying that it was likely true, but I don't blame them for wondering.
Deliberately with the Western Allied powers to divide Berlin into 4 occupation zones, deliberately sought to delay and frustrate attempts by the British, Americans and French to drive to Berlin through Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany and take over their allotted occupation zones. And the first Western Allied troops actually arrived in Berlin on the 4th of July 1945, 2 months after the Red Army had captured the city. By that time, the first phase of the Cold War had broken out to some degree between West and East. Arriving Allied troops wanted to see the ruined Reich Chancellery, Hitler's official seat of power, and the Fura bunker, where he had dramatically died when Soviet forces were less than half a kilometer away, but the Soviets continued to resist admission, particularly to the bunker, which had deteriorated considerably since its capture. When the Red Army had captured the bunker, its pumps, ventilation, and lighting had all been operational, power coming from a U-boat engine. However, the power was then shut off, and Soviet troops made a horrendous mess searching the 2-story bunker for evidence. The rooms were looted or very thoroughly searched, which, coupled with the hasty abandonment of the complex by the SS on the night of the 1st to 2nd of May 1945, meant that it was in a terrible state. The SS had also set fire to some of the bunker's upper rooms, leaving them in a very poor state. Berlin has a very high water table, so with pumps switched off, water began to seep into the lower bunker, where Hitler had died, leaving it with a few centimeters of dirty brown water in all of the rooms.
Interesting. So is the area around Berlin like a swampy, voice crack, a swampy landscape? Also, well, I was gonna say, now it doesn't sound great. If you're the Soviets and you made it there, why rush if you can just not admit the British and Americans to come in? But, I mean, the war technically isn't over yet, and you don't want to give that vibe and just be like, nope, you can't come in. So I think I answered my own question. Never mind.
Closed up and unventilated, mold soon began to grow on the bunker's walls, the
Are we
remaining
the
furniture
baddies?
and abandoned clothing. A dark, dingy, musty and damp hole in the ground that bore little resemblance to how it looked when Hitler lived and worked in it during the last months of the war. Some Allied soldiers and war correspondents did manage to obtain access to the Führer bunker, normally by bribing Soviet sentries with cigarettes or alcohol, and many souvenirs were taken that survive today in museums or private collections. By the guttering light of cigarette lighters or handheld electric torches, journalists snapped photos of the dilapidated and waterlogged rooms. The Allied leaders were due to meet at the Sicilienhof Palace at Potsdam to determine the future course of the war against Japan and many of the issues concerning ravaged Europe, and the Soviets prepared to meet the two most important leaders who would arrive by plane at Tempelhof Airport on the 14th of July 1945. US President Harry S. Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Before going to Potsdam, the Soviets arranged whistle-stop tours of the battered sites of the fallen Nazi regime, in particular the Reich Chancellery and the Führer bunker. President Truman appeared rather disinterested in the sites he was shown, merely surveying the wrecked buildings from the comfort of his vehicle, but Churchill was a bit more adventurous. The President and the Prime Minister travelled with very large entourages, and in Churchill's inner group were his daughter, Mary Churchill, an officer in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, a host of other generals and brigadiers, and his personal physician, Lord Moran, not to mention Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. Churchill drove to the Brandenburg Gate, sitting in the front passenger seat of a Royal Military Police jeep. Churchill was in uniform, dressed in his uniform as Honorary Colonel of the 4th 5th Cinque Ports Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, a position he had assumed in 1941, his lightweight summer tunic adorned with his rows of medal ribbons awarded for his earlier campaigns as a professional army officer and war correspondent. During the visit, he was fairly lightly protected. Red Army soldiers controlled the streets, of course, and Churchill's group included military policemen, his police bodyguards, and members of his inner circle. But German civilians were not kept back, and the visit was unannounced, and soon a fair-sized crowd gathered to see the man the Nazis had told them was their dread enemy for 6 long years of war.
I'm not surprised by the difference in, wanting to take in everything and learn more about what you're seeing between Churchill is more hands-on, wanting to see stuff, and Truman's more, seemingly not caring as much. And the Americans, yeah, you lost many, many thousands of soldiers and everything, but you didn't experience the same war as definitely the Russians, the Soviets, or even the British, And so, nor do you have the history on the continent that, the British and the Russians have. So I understand the different level and curiosity and wanting to look at things that Truman and Churchill have. It makes sense.
Churchill recorded his own wariness at seeing German civilians as he dismounted from his jeep in front of the Reich Chancellery on Wilhelmstrasse. When I got out of the car and walked about among them, except for one old man who shook his head disapprovingly, they all began to cheer. My hate died with their surrender, and I was much moved by their demonstrations, and also by their haggard looks and threadbare clothes. Then we entered the Chancellery, and for quite a long time walked through its shattered galleries and halls. It was a triumphant moment for Churchill, yet it appeared to give him no pleasure. The Allied bombing of Berlin and the subsequent street fighting during the battle for the city had reduced Hitler's grandiose Reich Chancellery to a ravaged ruin. Soviet looting had finished the job. Its once elegant rooms piled with rubbish and broken furniture, broken military equipment and ornaments. Churchill, supporting himself using a gold-topped cane, poked about, puffing on his ubiquitous cigar, gazing at the devastation. In Hitler's enormous office, two of its chandeliers lying crashed and broken on the floor, he gazed upon the Führer's upturned desk, shuffling through papers and iron crosses that carpeted the floor. Soviet guides kept up a running commentary as Churchill's group progressed through the giant rooms, but Churchill was largely silent. Next in the itinerary was Hitler's bunker, reached via a tunnel and then flights of steps from within the Reich Chancellery building. The way underground was lit by the dancing beams of electric torches held by the accompanying Red Army soldiers. The steps were wet and slippery, the atmosphere sultry and dingy. It was a hot day, and Churchill, hardly a fit man, began to feel tired, carefully navigating the slippery steps and detritus down to the upper bunker deep beneath the Reich Chancellery garden. He managed to get halfway down, but when he was told there were still 2 more long staircases to descend, he decided that he had seen enough. His daughter and many of the party continued on to Hitler's final bolt hole, while Churchill was directed outside via the Führer bunker's emergency exit, the very set of steps that Hitler's corpse was carried up 2 months earlier to be cremated in the garden. Churchill staggered out through the open armored door in the emergency exit's concrete bunker.
Are you telling me there were no pictures taken of Hitler's corpse from the Soviets finding him dead to the point where they set him on fire? There were you can really it seems like such a awkward is a great word, an awkward kind of victory where, like, as you can imagine, like the Soviets, like alongside him, like tell him all these things, and Truman obviously not really paying much attention when he's in the car, and then same with Churchill, even when he's on foot, walking throughout the Chancellery or whatever. Because it's like, you won the war, the most devastating war in history, or at least in Europe at this point. You still have Japan to deal with. But there seemed to be this fierce dislike between, like, it's like you won a war against your main enemy, sort of with, I don't know if you want to call the Soviets your lesser enemy, but maybe ideological enemy. And so it seems like a weird victory over such a giant thing, and it just seems kind of awkward. Like, not the grand sort of relief that should have came with such a victory in such a war. And so it's so strange how you go on from such a destructive war to immediately, British and America versus the Soviets in this kind of ideological war. Something just seems very unsatisfying to the victors. I would say especially the non-Soviets, because the Soviets made it there, and the Soviets face a much more thorough defeat than the British and obviously the Americans did, and I understand the difference in thought, but it just seems like a sort of unsatisfactory defeat accompanied with a sort of awkward walking around. I hope you get my main gist.
Out through the open armored door in the emergency exit's concrete bunker. Unsteady on his feet, a Soviet sentry grabbed his elbow to steady him, and he was led to a battered and broken armchair placed outside the emergency exit to rest for a while. The chair, the Soviets told him, was Hitler's from his bunker study. Churchill mopped sweat from his brow with a handkerchief while chatting with members of his party and waiting for his daughter and the other members of his group to return from below ground.
Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I understand the Soviets' absolute hatred for the Germans. I completely understand it. You suffered many more times the casualties, and a serious threat. The British did have that threat with the Battle of Britain, but it was once the eyes turned to the Soviets, I'm sure the British could have had a little sigh of relief that they're no longer the main target. So I understand why the Soviets. I'm not being like, really, you couldn't have. But there seems to be a kind of like, okay, we got here, but did you really have to just like absolutely destroy all of like the evidence and I don't know. It just seems like such an unsatisfactory finale for the Western allies entering the city.
After a while, they appeared, and he rose and walked the few paces to the pit, where the Soviets said the bodies of Hitler and his wife had been buried after their cremation on the 30th of April 1945. Churchill gazed into the pit, poking with his stick at a couple of bullet-riddled jerry cans that held the petrol that had been used to burn Hitler, and then turned abruptly and walked away. Most of the rest of Churchill's stay in Berlin was taken up by the Potsdam Conference with Stalin and President Truman, and 10 days later he was out of office, after having lost the general election, replaced as Prime Minister by Clement Attlee, who took over at the talks. It is nonetheless interesting that after having led Britain and the Empire since 1940 through all the uncertainties and horrors of World War, one of his last acts as war leader was to have visited the site of his greatest enemy's ultimate defeat and death, completing the long journey from the defeat at Dunkirk 6 summers before. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.
Do you know what I mean? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? It's like a great, this was the finale, but it's like, how do I, this is going to seem like an inappropriate comparison, but it's like being promised being able to use a toy, but after this other guy uses the toy and they like completely destroy it and then hand it to you, still workable, but it's like, oh, great, but you couldn't have let me have any joy in the capture or anything like that. I understand that in warfare, like while you're being shot at, to hell with your joy or whatever. My goal is to end this country with as few casualties on my side, and so as soon as possible. I'm talking about the post-capture of the city. The way that the Soviets seem to handle it is hard for me to criticize because of what they went through, but also it's easier for me to criticize because what the hell, man? Why couldn't I see this stuff? And just like the poking at the jerry cans and then leaving is another example of the mood I feel in this video of like, I imagine like a bunch of enthusiastic Soviets being like, see, here was Hitler's body after we got him and then torched him and then buried here. And it's like, oh yeah, that's great. You killed him and you killed, it's great, but okay, moving on. I'm getting a strong sense of that feeling from a very short video, but I can't help but feel it. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. I don't know, but again, it's a little uncomfortable for me to judge the Soviets' handling of Berlin after what Berlin put the Soviets through. So it's like I understand it, but Anyways, very cool video. Awesome. I love y'all. Hope you guys are all doing well. Would appreciate any comments as always, any answers to my questions, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Bye, guys.